I'm very happy to invite you all and to share this event with you all. And I'm very happy for inviting Aparna Kulkarni madam in this session. This session is an idea which I had in my mind since years. Okay, as a student of economics, I always imagined myself to be, a policy maker. I wanted to be a policy maker, but I landed up as being a professor. But always had this curiosity that how the policy makers came the policies, especially the fiscal policy. And I my students, BA or BCom, all my students, when they learn about government fiscal policy or monetary policy, we learn the basics, we by heart all those tools, but we really don't know at the government level or at the RBI level how it is implemented. So I wanted some person, some resource person who is, very knowledgeable and good at it, at explaining how at government level all these policies are actually implemented. And with this idea in mind, I invited for handling this session. So this session we have kept, the title is Fiscal Policy Framework in India, Allocation and Implications. So let me introduce, before our speaker for the day. So Aparna Kulkarni ma'am is currently working in St. Xavier's College, Churchgate. All of you are aware about this college. And she is a prolific writer. She has written several articles in newspapers. And one important thing, why I have invited her today is because she has been invited by many news channels when the budget is presented, okay, to discuss upon. We see that there are different forums on channels which keep on discussing the budget on the day of budget. So she is, she has been a panelist in such forums, especially this year. She was invited on Sam TV, which is a Marathi channel. So I'm really happy to have her here to explain everything to my students today. Actually, the department is very proud to have this session for our students to know actually how the policies are framed, and to give all the students an idea, or rather make my students, at least for today, giving them some hands-on experience of being policy makers. So with this small introduction of Aparna ma'am, I would now like invite Aparna ma'am to present her screen and start with the session.
Thank you, Professor Samiksha. Thank you for your kind words. And I take this opportunity to talk to you as well as your students. And I'm happy to share the policymakers' perspective here. I don't know whether I'll be able to live up to your expectations, but I'll try my best to share some of the thoughts with you. And also, over the years, the experience that I have got in terms of teaching economics, and also the understanding and interpretation of the policy making, with special focus on the fiscal policy and monetary policy. So when Professor Samiksha and we were discussing the objectives of this kind of workshop, we found that there's hardly any college or university that is offering such kind of syllabi which will focus on the policy maker's perspective. In the sense, where hardly it happens that you get to learn public finance or expenditure policy, expenditure profile of the government, how it is affecting the state finances, and therefore thereby affecting the common man's life. So in our mainstream curriculum, We don't have such aspect that is ever shared with the students. So then when we were discussing this kind of a topic, we came to the conclusion that it is important to reach out to the students to have this kind of discussion on a particular platform and to share this particular perspective and to know what students feel about it, because everybody has a notion related to what our fiscal policy should be, how the government should behave, and the kind of fiscal modeling that happens in the current context. Therefore, the plan was made, and here today we are having this session on the fiscal allocations in our country and implications. If you look at the title, you will find that we are not just talking about the allocations that have been made so far, but also the implications of it, the consequences as well. So I'm really thankful to Professor Samiksha for inviting me, Professor Rahul Dandekar, and I think this is for the second time I'm talking to your students, so I'm really happy to have with all of you. So to begin with this topic, to begin with what I am willing to share with you, I'll just share my screen. Okay, so the topic that I have chosen today, I hope my screen is visible to everyone.
Yes, it is visible.
Yes, thank you. So as I mentioned, the topic that I have chosen for today's session is fiscal policy framework in India, allocations and implications, right? Now, many a times when we talk about fiscal policy, we often tend to feel that, oh, it is all about taxes and the expenditure incurred by the government. But then for your information, let me tell you, fiscal policy is a very important, I would say, fiscal policy tools, they play a very important task as far as the macroeconomic management is concerned. Also, it has greater impact on the consumer's life. All of us are consumers. So then when we decide our individual budget, the budget that comes from the government, it has a greater impact on our day-to-day life. That is why it is very much important for every individual to think about it and to have a kind of opinion making related to how our budget should be made. And as a developing economy with this kind of democratic setup, I always feel that socialization of the budget process is very, very essential. So unless and until every individual in our society knows about it and have a particular perspective, it's not possible to create the awareness about fiscal framework and then economic literacy also. So from the literacy point of view, economic literacy point of view, this socialization of budget is very, very important. And there are people who at various levels, like in media, in academia, in industry, people talk about it, but then at the very lower strata of the society, whether we have that kind of discussion, unfortunately no. And as Professor Samiksha mentioned, uh, there is always a political economy dimension associated with the budgetary framework, and as it is always said, good economics is bad politics. So politicians and the leaders of the society, political leaders basically, they always have their priorities and they try to push their agenda. Therefore, if the real socialization of the budgetary framework happens, it might go against the interests of these political parties which are in power. And therefore, sometimes I feel that the actual socialization and the trickle down does not happen. So that's a very unfortunate thing, considering the economic exclusion that we have in our country. So in pure sense, if you just go by the theoretical sense of fiscal policy framework, you find that it is a very effective tool, and at various levels this fiscal policy is going to help us, not just in macroeconomic modeling, but also from welfare point of view. Fiscal policy is very, very important. But then from academic point of view, unfortunately in our country, in our mainstream curriculum, we do not have this subject, or hardly
Aparna, you are muted.
Okay, am I audible now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So my point was, in terms of socialization of the budget in the academic field, lot of work has to be done, and therefore academic field can play a very important role in socializing this kind of a subject. Now, coming to the fiscal policy framework in particular, it has to be noted that there are 4 tools of fiscal policy. I hope all of you are able to follow the sequence of my slides. I'm on slide number 2. Is it visible?
Yes, yes, it is visible.
Okay. So then there are 4 tools of fiscal policy, namely government expenditure, then taxation, then deficit financing if there is a public debt. Now here I'm using the term if there is public debt, because it's not necessary that you always land up in terms of, or you always land in a situation where there is a deficit. If there is deficit, then it is financed through debt structuring, and therefore with such debt structure, deficit financing takes place. So deficit financing and public debt are 2 different things, whereas our focus is mainly on the expenditure policy and the taxation policy. Now, the economic theory argues that in the 3-sector economy, let me talk about the pure macroeconomic perspective to look at this fiscal policy in terms of our national income accounting and so on, because I'm sure many of you must have studied that, or you at least are familiar with the term that is national income accounting. So therefore here, when we have a 3-sector model, that is firm is there, and then there is household sector, and in addition to that you have government. Now when these 3 sectors interact with each other, government as a system, they always have their own ways to earn. So they have their revenue collected through the taxation system, and this revenue collection is spent for different sectors in the economy. So for employment creation, for the infrastructure development, for welfare policies, the tax revenue is basically spent. And this taxation, basically it is known as the tool for redistribution of income, because as we all know, the market fundamentalist system, which is driven by demand and supply, this kind of a system fails in achieving distributive justice, right? So some people earn more, some people earn less, and in an economy like India, where the size of the cake is so small as compared to the stakeholders, everyone cannot get due share, cannot get his or her own pie in that particular cake. So considering the size, we are a very populous country. So then in a country like India, when we have income inequality and the trickle down effect is weak, we need to have a redistributive tool, which is taxation, right? So then in terms of taxation, we impose the taxes on luxurious goods, we impose the taxes on rich people, elite class in the society, and that income, which is tax revenue collection, this income is utilized for the poor or weaker sections in the society. So from that point of view, from a redistribution point of view, taxation is an important, a very effective tool. Coming to expenditure, we all know that government expenditure is incurred on various items, and there are a lot of theories in public economics which will justify like why this expenditure is required. Now political economists, they always argue that the state has to be a welfare state, so state has to carry the welfare expenditure throughout, so that the economically excluded classes, they will become a part of your mainstream activity. So from that point of view, expenditure, incurring expenditure for infra, for employment, for welfare, that becomes essential. So these are primary tools of the fiscal policy. And here you find that since the expenditure is ever increasing and taxation is not able to suffice the expenditure needs, the governments may, typically they have the fiscal deficit, and there is a revenue deficit also, and primary deficit. So mainly there are 3 categories of the budgetary deficit. which will further give rise to the debt policy. So in order to bridge the gap between tax revenue and government's expenditure, sometimes this debt is accumulated, and for a developing economy like India, this debt is a very common policy. Commonly, our central government as well as the state governments, they do carry this public debt. Now, coming to the actual status of the four tools, or mainly the deficit and the revenue part of our fiscal framework, here we find that and I also mentioned that there are three deficit trends that we follow. One is the revenue deficit, second is the fiscal deficit, and there is another one which is primary deficit. So if you now look at the major trends in fiscal tools in India, you find that there is a correlation, there is a very strong relation between all such variables of fiscal policy. So if you consider the size of our GDP, so all these bars, they are showing you the size of GDP in our country, and the GDP numbers are in crores, they are in lakh crores, whereas the deficit trends are shown in terms of the percentage of GDP. So then the fiscal deficit as a percentage of GDP, primary deficit as a percentage of GDP, and so on. And here I have added one more factor, that is CapEx, capital expenditure. And why I have added capital expenditure here, I will explain it in a moment. So coming to the major trends in fiscal tools in India, you find that the year 2020-21, the GDP growth, it was very much affected by the pandemic situation, so that the consistent rise in the GDP size, that particular trend was disturbed by the pandemic year. So then the impact of the lockdowns on our economic activity, etc., that is clearly seen. So here the last bar, if you follow this, the last bar shows that the GDP growth has declined in the fiscal year 2020-21 as a result of the crisis, which was very much expected, and that's how we have the decline in GDP growth in the fiscal year 2020-21. Now, when the GDP has declined, what are the major trends in terms of our deficit? Okay, because if the size of the GDP itself is shrinking, then whether the government is able to have the revenue expenditure as per expectations, and therefore how it is going to affect the tax revenue as well as the expenditure on infrastructure, etc. So here you find the pink line here. It shows that earlier, that is before 2019-20, there was a consistency. There was a particular trend in terms of our gross tax revenue, and then India fortunately had achieved this consistency in tax revenue collection. So it was the direct taxation as well as the indirect tax policy. So the tax compliance used to take place, but suddenly, because of the economic slowdown before the pandemic and after the pandemic, of course, the tax compliance has gone down. So gross revenue tax collection, so the gross tax revenue here, it has gone down. So this pink line, this trend line shows that again there is a decline in the revenue collection along with the decline in GDP. So that is about the tax revenue. But does it mean that because of such decline in the revenue, we've also reduced the expenditure on different objectives like infrastructure or employment? That question we can answer with the help of our deficit trend. So here you find that on the one hand, when the revenue was declining, revenue collection was weaker, at the same time, what was the expenditure trend here? This expenditure trend shows that along with the gross tax revenue, the consistency in terms of the revenue deficit and fiscal deficit was also evident before 2018-19 or up till 18-19. After that, when the revenue collection started declining, but the expenditure allocation, it was continuously there. right? So this means that we never made a compromise in terms of the capital expenditure, and so is the case with the revenue expenditure. So the expenditure was continuously occurring. Therefore, because of the fiscal commitments, like you have to give the salaries, there are subsidies, transfer payments, and so on. So on the revenue account there was continuous expenditure. Also on the capital account the expenditure was continuously occurring. As a result, if you look at the trend in terms of the revenue and the fiscal deficit, you will see that there is a sharp increase in both, right? So fiscal deficit has sharply increased. Also, the revenue deficit has increased sharply. Now, there are two reasons mainly. One is the economic slowdown. So then certain sectors like automobile and the telecom sector, they got some kind of fiscal incentives. Another thing is, after the crisis and there was lockdown, etc., it was very much pertinent and expected that government has to help the economy by giving the package. So then that Atmanirbhar Bharat Yojana, under that particular scheme of self-reliant India, the heavy expenditure for medium, small, and the micro enterprises, that is MSMEs, and again the Garib Kalyan Yojana. As a result of that, there was heavy allocation made. Therefore, the fiscal deficit line here, it shows the sharp increase. So deficit was on increasing path. And here I would like to draw your attention to the capex, which is capital expenditure. Now, for every economy, from welfare and development point of view, capital formation is very, very important. And this capital formation is not just expected in the private sector, but it is equally expected in the public sector. So then, for capital formation in public sector, this capex has to improve consistently. Now again, fortunately in India, you will find that there was consistency in the capital formation. The capex was consistently there. But after the year 2019-20, and even during 2020-21, the major period of the pandemic, here the capex has also sharply increased. Now here you need to think about one thing. There is a very important thing that you have to concentrate on, and that is the quality of fiscal management in our country. Now if you just compare the fiscal situation in India with any other Western country, or for that matter advanced countries, you will find that most of the countries today, they are fighting with the disequilibrium position from economic point of view. Secondly, the macroeconomic management, that has become a daunting task. So then when other countries are recording negative growth, fortunately in India, we are we have actually shown satisfactory performance, even though the crisis period was there. But the size of the GDP, the extent to which GDP has it has gone down in other countries, that kind of GDP contraction has not taken place in India. And I'm making such statements with lot of responsibility here, because I'm talking to the students. But then as a very responsible citizen of this society, I must put it on record that though there were difficulties that we have faced, but then government of India fortunately has not made any sacrifice in terms of our capital expenditure. And with reference to this year's budget especially, there is a 30% increase in the capital expenditure. So though we are struggling with the pandemic, we are slowly recovering, and now the restrictions are lifted, and slowly the consumer movement, aggregate demand, is upticking slowly. But then even though this situation is in existence, but still the capex is continuously rising. So then that's a very good note, or rather that's a good news for us, that in public sector capital formation is taking place. And then the allocation made for the capital expenditure, it is increasing. So that's a good thing. Then coming to some of the expenditure components, because continuously we are talking about the expenditure incurred by the government as a important policy tool. But then what are the items on which there is expenditure incurred by the government? And here I would mainly focus on CSS, that is the centrally sponsored schemes, right? I hope you are able to see this slide, which is giving you a list of all these schemes for which the central government is making heavy allocations, right? So coming to these schemes, you will find that for urban sector and urban development, urban the renewal mission that we have, JNNURM, that is Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission, is the biggest scheme for the urban development that government of India is making heavy allocations for. And that this kind of mission was very much required considering the rate of urbanization in our country. Population experts or demographic scientists say that by 2050, more than 50% of India's population will become urban. Now, if that is the trend that we have in India, then it is very, very essential to make provision for urban development, right? So, and I think this is exactly what the government of India is following, and therefore for this JNNURM, heavy allocations are made. So these schemes, they have major contribution in our expenditure, followed by accelerated irrigation benefit program, which is for improving the status of irrigation in Indian agriculture. Then we have social assistance program. Here I would like to mention the allocations made in last year's budget for care economy. If fortunately, with the upcoming trend, we find that in every year's budget there are certain sectors identified by the government and allocations are made as per the needs. So infrastructure, employment creation and agriculture are the three core areas of our fiscal program, or the fiscal policy that we are designing. And therefore it was realized that for the agriculture sector, though we are having subsidies, and then for agricultural inputs lot of subsidization takes place, but still for the long term effect and long term multiplier effect, we need to make provision for the irrigation first, because irrigation is the need for agriculture, and unless and until we improve the irrigation status, agriculture is not going to flourish. And therefore for agriculture and the irrigation in agriculture, there is a this AIBP program launched during the UPA government, but continuously budget after budget we are having the allocation for the irrigation program. Then for care economy, social assistance program is also implemented. Then there is a special scheme called as Krishi Vikas Yojana. There is allocation for that. And then the largest scheme for the employment creation, which is MG Narega, right? Now this MG Narega, it has shown wonderful impact after the lockdowns were imposed. So then the migrant workers, those who are going back to their places, since the urban sector activities were stagnant, those village workers then they could get minimum employment just because of MG Narega. So then MG Narega is really a very effective tool to provide sufficient employment opportunities in the rural sector, and that is the reason why now it is discussed at the national level whether we should have similar program for urban employment. So for urban employment guarantee, should we really have this kind of program on the in the line of the MG Narega which we have for the rural sector? And very soon I think such urban employment guarantee scheme will be launched, because it is in pipeline, and at the finance ministry level the discussions are going on. Now, in relation with this Narega scheme, here I would also like to mention that during the lockdowns, we realized that in India, the trend of interstate migration is very, very strong. And then it was also found that there are, in the labor market, at least in case of the informal sector, majority of the informal sector workers are migrants, and from mega cities in the country, these migrant workers where they were going back. It means that if this is the strong trend of migrant workers in the country, we need to have some mainstream policy for such migrant workers. Therefore, now the government of India is planning to have national migration policy. And this national migration policy, there will be certain political aspects of it, because migrant workers, they should get the right to vote wherever they are, so they don't have to go back to their native place for voting. Because again, it has the transport cost, it comes along with the transport cost, and it's not necessary that everyone will be able to incur the cost and everyone will be willing to go back to their native place for voting, just for one day. People might not go, and therefore it is essential that migrant workers, they should have the right to vote wherever they are, right? That is one thing, the political aspect, and the demography, the democracy which is related to the election process, voting, etc. Secondly, these migrant workers should also be able to get all the facilities, like they should get the ration card, they should be availed of the services of public distribution system and so on. So MG Narega, which is the scheme implemented during the lockdown mainly for the migrant workers, those who came back to their villages, now we are going one step ahead and we are planning to have the national migration policy. That is one thing. And the government of India also is willing to maintain national migrant register, right? So during the CAA, you must have heard that we have a national population register, right? So as per your place of birth, you are registered as a citizen of the society. But then if you migrate, then it's difficult to keep track of where you are as a citizen of the society, and there are political as well as economic implications of that. Therefore, if we can maintain national migrant register, we will be able to keep track of where people go, and then we will also be able to understand the trend of interstate migration in our country. So then this issue of migration in relation with the employment creation, I think now we have got that integrated approach to look at migration and employment creation both in the rural as well as the urban areas. So MG Narega, again, it's a really very big scheme for which allocations are made heavily. Then PMAY, which is Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, then PM Gati Shakti, whereby we are making huge allocations for infrastructure. Now this year's budget, it mentions that there are 7 drivers in the transport sector, or you can say the infrastructure sectors. There are 7 key drivers of it, and the government is allocating budget and budgetary provisions for those 7 sectors in the transport. The other scheme for which the allocations are made, that is NIP, National Infrastructure Pipeline, followed by food security mission. So these are the major schemes or major public sector programs which make heavy contribution in centrally sponsored schemes, and that's a part of our public expenditure. So when we focus on the expenditure policy, here we find that the centrally sponsored schemes, they have the biggest contribution in our total expenditure. So if I have to show you the composition of public sector or public expenditure in India, you find that there are 6 major items or 6 major components for which the expenditure allocation takes place. Now this data I have borrowed from this year's budget budget highlights. So then it says that establishment expenditure of the center, which means that there are public sector undertakings for which the expenditure allocation is made. So for such PSUs, there are allocations. Then central sector schemes, so then central government is incurring expenditure in industry, agriculture and services, which is forming the central sector schemes, followed by central sector expenditure. That means schemes are different from the the allocations that are made in isolation. So for schemes, allocations are made specifically, and then the expenditure which is incurred by the central government only, but for different type of programs. So that is the expenditure which is different from the centrally sponsored schemes. Then there are finance commission grants. Now if you all know that in our country, from development point of view, And also from the fiscal federalism point of view, we follow a federal structure. So then whenever taxes are collected and the expenditure is incurred, we follow the federal route. So central government at the higher level, they are collecting taxes, and then the tax pool, it is distributed among the states. So in order to strengthen this federal structure, finance commission is set up every 5 to 10 years, and then within the span of 10 years, because first 5 years, they make the plan, and the next 5 years that is implemented. So for 10 years time span, this finance commission, it has to implement all its suggestions. So finance commission grants are there, and in budgetary framework only, you have to implement the suggestions made by the finance commission. So finance commission grants, they also form a part of the total expenditure, followed by other grants or the loans to the state governments and so on. So if you now go by such composition, you find that the majority of the expenditure allocation is made for the it is made for the centrally sponsored schemes and different sectoral allocations that are made. This means that if you just follow this trend line here, if you look at these bars, you will understand that the finance commission grants and centrally sponsored schemes, they make heavy contribution in our total expenditure. Ultimately, if you look at the consequences, you find that we are expecting expenditure multiplier through this, right? So when you look at the implications or the consequences of having such heavy allocation, that is for capex, capital expenditure, infrastructure, employment and so on, we are rather expecting that there will be government expenditure multiplier, right? But when we are expecting such multiplier, we need to focus on one thing, that fiscal policy, considering its time frame, fiscal policy needs medium to long term for realizing its impact, right? So then the efficiency of fiscal policy here, it has a constraint. What is that constraint? The constraint here is the time frame. You can't just expect that this year we make the allocation and next year we'll get the benefit. That it's not going to happen. Why? Because this expenditure allocation made for the sectors like agriculture, irrigation, or maybe the industrial sector investment, it has long gestation period. So in the long term, we are expecting this expenditure multiplier. In the short run, it's not going to be possible. So when you compare fiscal policy with monetary policy, we need to always remember that monetary policy has short term, or the time frame here is very short, so that within short span of time you can expect the results. But in case of fiscal policy, it is not possible, right? So here all the centrally sponsored schemes, finance commission grants, etc., are the effects of such allocations that can be seen only in medium to long term, right? So that we need to be patient in terms of yielding the effects or benefits of the fiscal policy. That is, no fiscal policy maker can just do wonder in just 1 or 2 years. That is not possible, okay? And as students of economics, we tend to compare the impact of fiscal policy with the monetary policy. But when such impact is seen, we need to make sure that it is always going to happen in medium to long term, right? So that is something that we need to keep in mind. And let me now come to another important thing, which is the priorities of the government. And here I'm focusing mainly on the central government. State finances, it forms a different part of it. So focusing on the central government, if you look at the prioritization that has taken place over the years, we realized that the capital expenditure should get more prominence than the revenue expenditure, because revenue expenditure, that represents the fiscal commitments. So there are certain areas in which the expenditure has to be incurred, and that's the mandate, that's the obligation. But capital expenditure, if we focus more on that, there are several benefits, okay? There are many advantages. One, capital formation takes place, and the capital formation that is taking place in public sector, it is not it is not exclusive at all, rather it is very much inclusive. Therefore, for inclusive development, this capital expenditure or the allocations for capital formation, that will be a key in our development process. Therefore, there is more focus on the capital expenditure, less on the revenue expenditure. So you find over the years, that is from 2014-15 onwards, you find that the revenue and capital expenditure as a percentage of our total expenditure, you find that the revenue expenditure, though it had shown slight spike in 2020-21, but then after that, the in last 2 financial years, this revenue expenditure has gone down drastically and the capital expenditure has increased. Okay, so there's a sharp increase in the capital expenditure as a result of the allocations made in infrastructure sector and communication, transport and communication. Therefore, since we have identified these 2 sectors, transport, communication and infrastructure, there are heavy allocations made, and because of such allocations, capital expenditure has shown sharp increase, whereas revenue expenditure is slowly going down, which is a good sign. We are on right track to have inclusive development in our country. Again, if you now come to the counterpart of expenditure, on the very first slide, I was, I think, talking about the flow of this session. So then we considered the aspect of expenditure. Now coming to the taxation part, you find that in our country we are following a strict framework for taxation, right? So what is that framework? In terms of direct taxes, okay, so in terms of direct taxes, we follow the conventions, but for indirect taxes, we are following a very unconventional method. Why unconventional? Because prior to the implementation of GST, we never had this kind of tax consolidation policy. GST represents the consolidated taxation policy, because in GST, all the taxes related to the production and sale of goods and as well as the services, that has been consolidated. So for indirect taxes, now we have the GST policy, and this GST has the contribution of 29% in the total tax revenue, followed by the corporation tax and the taxes on income other than corporation tax, which means that in our total tax revenue collection, GST is the it is the biggest contributor, followed by the direct taxes, that is corporation tax and taxes other than the income tax in the corporate sector. And the union excise duties, they have 15% contribution, and the custom duties, they are contributing 6% of in the total tax revenue collection. Now this shows that the collection of GST, it is playing a very important role in our fiscal framework. Now this GST, it is not just a part, or it is not just the aspect of our taxation policy from the central government's point of view, but it has lot of association, or a very strong association, with our fiscal federalism, the federal structure that we follow. Because when the GST was implemented, there were political economy issues associated with that, and there are people who argue that this GST collection has hampered the status of state finances. Why? Because now state governments are not in position to collect the indirect taxes, because all the indirect taxes are collected by the central government in the name of GST. In terms of GST framework, those taxes are collected by the center. Now central government is supposed to distribute that GST collection among the states, but unfortunately this is not happening in timely and accessible manner. Okay, now therefore you find that there is a tension between the center state relations, and this was particularly highlighted during the pandemic period. Why? Because during the pandemic, state governments, they were on the forefront. So state governments, they were supposed to incur the expenditure for health sector, but unfortunately the tax pool or the tax revenue for the state governments, it was very, very short, and that is why they were not able to do that. So all states were demanding that now central government has to distribute the GST collection, and all states should get their due share, so that we will be able to respond to the crisis situation. So then recently, two installments of the GST collection, they have been allotted to the states. And to strengthen the state finances, now the government has come up with the loan procedure and the borrowing capacity of the state governments. It has increased to some extent. So central government was instrumental in changing the structure for borrowing capacity of the state finances. But this GST, it is always it is discussed, and it is widely debated issue in our country. But there are some good effects also, because the consolidation has taken place. Earlier we did not have a consolidated tax policy for the goods and services, but now fortunately that kind of policy is in place, so that it is possible to keep track of how the tax compliance is taking place in our country. So from that point of view, and for having a good database of the taxpayers in our country, this GST is playing an important role. Now here we find that if you consider the tools like tax compliance, or the tool like increasing the tax base, widening the tax base in our country, you find that the fiscal room or fiscal capacity for strengthening the tax base is very weak. Okay, India is a country where only 8 to 9% of people, 8 to 9% of the total population, they are paying the income tax, right? So the taxable capacity itself is very, very less as compared to the advanced countries. And then those 8 to 9% people who pay income tax to the government, they also have the tax avoidance, the tendency to avoid the tax to some extent. And people are there who try to avoid the tax, not just the direct tax, that is income, etc., but people also try to avoid the other taxes. So there are people, and there are ways in which the GST can also be reduced. So it keeps happening, and then it's a human tendency. So then, considering this tax avoidance as against the taxable capacity of people, if the tax base is very narrow, then we can't expect that the tax revenue can help us in improving the status of the fiscal framework. Tax policy or tax multiplier here, it is not possible. So I always feel that tax is not a very strong tool of our fiscal policy if you compare it with the expenditure policy. So we need to focus more on expenditure multiplier, because the tax route or the tax channel of fiscal framework is very, very weak, right? Though we have a very robust tax collection system, and then center and state financial machinery is there to collect the taxes, but still the taxable capacity, level of income itself is low. We belong to the middle income country group. So then the taxpayers here, they are less in number, so that the taxation side of our budgetary system, that is not showing a very satisfactory performance, and one has to admit that. So then, if you now compare the tax route or tax channel of the fiscal framework with the expenditure framework, you find that the public expenditure is ever increasing, whereas the tax revenue is not very strong. The revenue pool that we generate is not very strong, and therefore that is the reason why we end up having heavy deficit on our budget. And the main focus here is on the fiscal deficit. What is fiscal deficit? This fiscal deficit is the gap between tax revenue collection and the expenditure of the government, except the interest payment, right? So this fiscal deficit, what does it show? It shows the impact of the ever increasing expenditure on our fiscal framework. We do not have sufficient tax revenue to finance our expenditure policy, and unfortunately therefore we end up having high fiscal deficit. Last financial year, the extent of this fiscal deficit, it was 9.2%. right? Slowly, because of this recovery after the pandemic, we are expecting that next year this fiscal deficit will be limited up to 6.4. This fiscal it was 6.8%. This means that the fiscal deficit to GDP ratio in India is always very high, and this deficit, fiscal deficit mainly, it has lot of consequences. What are the consequences? Since there is deficit, we need to go for the debt policy, because somewhere we need to have the sources by which we can close the gap between the tax revenue and the expenditure of the government. So we keep on accumulating the debt, and if I show you the data related to debt, you will wonder. Okay, just look at this graph. You find that earlier, that is, much before 2009-10, there was a decline in the debt to GDP ratio. After that, to some extent, there was consistency, and as a result of the pandemic situation, economic slowdown, and lot of volatilities in our markets, now the debt to GDP ratio, it has gone up, and at the moment here, the debt to GDP ratio is 59.3%. So there's a sharp increase in the debt to GDP ratio, and this highlights the fact that because of the expenditure needs in our country, we are not left with any other option but to accumulate the debt, okay, which is the actual borrowing of the government. Again, let me remind you, I am talking about the debt to GDP ratio from the union government's or union budget point of view. We are yet to talk about the state finances, the debt accumulated by the state finances or state governments in India. So again, to confine to the central government here, last financial year 2020-21, we find that the debt to GDP ratio here, it has gone up to 59.3%, which underlines the fact that our fiscal framework somewhere, it needs to be revisited, and we need to actually discuss the rationale of why are we having this kind of very high debt to GDP ratio, why the fiscal deficit is rising, and so on. Okay, so this is the point where we need to do lot of discussion at the national level, not only the central government but the GST policy, the GST department, the association of all the experts that are related with GST framework, then the direct tax department, all of them have to sit together, and they need to ponder over this particular situation, that why exactly this debt to GDP ratio is as high as 59.3%. Okay, so that is about the debt. And now let me also explain the sources of deficit financing. Now, the question here is, why at all the deficit financing has to happen? The clear answer here is, since there is debt, since we are having very high debt to GDP ratio 59.3%, this means that there are some ways in which we need to finance this kind of deficit, which is also called as debt servicing. Okay, so in what ways we are dealing with the debt servicing? In what way we are repaying the loans that have been taken? So for deficit financing, the theory says that there are two sources. One is the internal source, other is external source. And the internal sources here are either you print new currency, or there are internal financial markets. So through open market operations, you just raise the funds. Okay, now again, in terms of macroeconomic point of view, if you print new currency, you need to carry the risk of inflation, because if there is excessive money supply, that will lead to demand pull inflation. So printing new currency, it comes along with the risk of high inflation. So can we really go for printing new currency? The clear answer to this question is no. Okay, unless the currency which is in existence, it is in bad position, no scholar, no economic expert will suggest you to print new currency. So currency replacement, it is okay, but printing new currency, that is not a desirable option that we can have. Secondly, if you go for internal sources, like you borrow from the you borrow from the central bank, or you are issuing public sector bonds, there are infrastructure bonds, municipal bonds. By issuing such financial instruments, debt instruments, basically you can raise the funds through internal sources, and that way you can just go for deficit financing. Again, when the government is creating liability in the form of government bonds, in the stipulated amount of time you're supposed to repay. Okay, so if you're able to repay, that's a good thing. Otherwise, you carry the heavy burden of the internal debt. That is one thing. So for internal sources also, there is an opportunity cost which you need to keep in mind. And there are external sources. Now, in the external route of deficit financing, it shows that either you can borrow heavily from the international organizations like IMF or World Bank, else you need to borrow from the exchange market, the open market, externally. Again, it comes with opportunity cost. So these are not really affordable ways to finance the deficit. But then, since there is deficit and we can't avoid it, either we go by the internal route for deficit financing, or there is external route. Now, if you look at the external borrowings of our government, those borrowings are very high. So the interest payment becomes an important part of our budgetary framework, and that's how we have primary deficit also. So then, again, managing the fiscal revenue and primary deficit, that has become a daunting task for the government, especially with the emergence of pandemic and the lockdowns, etc. This management of deficit financing, that has become very, very critical. Okay, so this is another point of discussion actually. Therefore, here, after having discussion on all such tools of fiscal policy, expenditure, then taxation, followed by deficit financing and the debt policy, here are some ways that we can present in the form of suggestions to strengthen our fiscal capacity. Okay, I hope you're able to see this particular slide, which is enlisting the ways in which fiscal capacity can be strengthened, right? So here, from taxation point of view, we should improve the tax compliance. So the degree to which taxpayers are able to follow the taxation policy, like they are paying the taxes, they are filing the returns, and the grievances are addressed, that entire machinery has to become robust, right? So tax compliance has to improve. So whatever 8 to 9% people are income taxpayers in our country, they won't avoid the tax, but rather they will pay the tax. And for such tax compliance, we need to have a very convenient taxation system. It should be simple, it should be flexible, and it should be user friendly or taxpayer friendly. So this kind of tax compliance has to be strengthened. Secondly, which is very important suggestion here, is the expenditure rationalization and consolidation has to take place. Now, here I would like to draw your attention to one particular fact, that in India we follow FRBM framework. What is FRBM? It is Fiscal Responsibility and Budgetary Management Act, which says that the fiscal deficit here, it should be limited up to 3% of your GDP. If it goes beyond, then we need to consolidate the deficit. We need to consolidate our expenditure in such a way that the with continuous capex, which is capital expenditure, still the deficit should not be more than 3%. So you cut down heavily on the revenue account expenditure. So the suggestion that follows this expenditure rationalization is heavy expenditure cut on the revenue account. So on revenue account, you should have minimum deficit, and on the capital account, we need to spend in a very rational way. So expenditure rationalization and consolidation, it has to happen. Also, here we find that in terms of our fiscal structure, we follow federal system. So there is a financial system or fiscal system for the central government, also the state governments. But then the increasing tension between the center and state relations, and the way in which the state governments, they have their own ideology, they have their own priorities. We find that central and state governments, they are not even in talking terms to each other, right? So for a democratic country like India, that's really bad. But then unfortunately, this is the fact that there is increasing tension between the center and the state. So instead of such, you can say, disturbed relation between the central and the state governments, we should rather have coordination, right? So we need to have follow that integrated framework, the holistic approach to manage central finance as well as the state finances. And for a federal system like us, it's very, very important. So they should go together, they should go hand in hand, so that the consolidated fiscal framework will improve. Otherwise, we will have more challenges in terms of the federal system that we follow. Okay, so the coordination is required, and the debt burden has to go down sharply, right? So in the previous diagram, I have shown you the graph for the debt to GDP ratio. It shows the sharp increase. Okay, but then this way, if the debt to GDP continuously increases, it will have unwanted and bad consequences in how we can manage our taxation and expenditure policy. So the debt burden should go down, so that we don't have to spare our resources for debt servicing, right? So that's the objective for reducing the debt burden. And then the last point here is robust mechanism for creating fiscal room, and it is for both central government as well as the state government. So we need to create enough fiscal room for the ongoing projects. We know that our country has lot of developmental needs, right? And then if those developmental expenses or those needs are to be addressed, we need to have fiscal space for that, right? So unless we create that robust mechanism, all our development projects will be halted, and that we can't afford. Therefore we require a robust mechanism to create fiscal room, not just for the central government but also for the state governments. Okay, so that way we need to look at the fiscal management in our country in a holistic way. We can't just isolate state finances from the central government. That isolation or separation should not happen, right? So with this, I finally arrive at the hypothesis here, the conclusion actually. And that conclusion is, in view of the constraints on the tax revenue, uh, tax multiplier channel in our fiscal framework is very weak. Okay, because we hardly have scope to reduce the taxes, considering the problems in terms of revenue collection. The revenue collection is not sufficient to finance our development activity. So further, if you go for tax reduction, we can't afford it, and that won't be a wise decision. So therefore, since the tax multiplier channel is weak, we can focus more on the expenditure multiplier. Okay, and this expenditure multiplier is a better alternative to enhance our fiscal mechanism, right? Now, after stating this final statement and after sharing my view with all of you, now I would like to comment on one particular, you can say, citizen sentiment here, right? Nowadays, in our country, there is a fashion to look at every fiscal or maybe economic activity either through the lens of right-wing ideology or left-wing ideology. We always tend to look at any issue or any policy or maybe any public program initiated by the government. We always tend to look at it through right-wing or the lens of left-wing, right? And that is the increasing fashion in our country. But I always feel that this kind of approach, and then the way people always criticize, So if the government is nationalist in nature, or if the government is following the nationalist ideology, people on the left, they always criticize that this is not the pro-poor government, this is not the pro-poor budget, and therefore how the industrial giants are helped, how they are supported. So that way the criticism goes on. If the government is following leftist ideology, people from industry would argue that this budget is against the industrial sector, and the government officials are not in favor of prosperity or asset creation. So these are the two extreme ways in which the criticism goes on. But now, as an impartial spectator, if you look at the budgetary framework, one has to understand that government is not a separate entity. The government is very much a part of it's a integral part of all of us, right? So then, if you believe in the principles of democracy, we elect the people, we are choosing our own representatives, and on our behalf they are just monitoring the system. And if that is true, then this fashion of looking at the fiscal framework from or through the lens of right wing ideology or left wing ideology, it doesn't hold the ground. And on the part of the society, it will be a wrong notion to just paste the labels like this is right wing or this is left wing budget or this is left wing fiscal policy. No, this should not be done. If you believe in democracy and if you completely believe in the constitutional principles in India, then one has to understand that government is an entity that is there to administer and to monitor the system. Therefore, they have their own needs, right? So they have to incur certain expenses, which is the committed fiscal transfer. And on the other hand, for the capital formation, they are supposed to incur the expenditure. So then, as a society, if you can follow the participatory approach, that it's not the job of the government always that they have to help in infrastructure development. It's not the job to provide safe water or to provide certain other amenities which you require. As a citizen of the country, we also have our due share. We also have to play our own role, so that we need not to depend on the government always, right? They are there to help us. We follow the idea of welfare state, so the government has to help us, it has to initiate, and it has to act as an organizational actor. But beyond that, do we have a connection between government and the citizens of the country? Do we have a strong communication channel? So to strengthen our fiscal framework, I think instead of that top to down approach, that government on the top, they will decide the policies, and the citizens of the society, they are on the receiver end. If this continues, then we can't expect inclusive development unless we have that vertical equality, that all citizens are equal and we are just helping the government. So if it is top to if it is bottom to top, so if you can just reverse the implementation process, I think then only we can expect the inclusive development in our country. And for such inclusive development, we should utilize the fiscal tools in a very, very rational manner. And that is the takeaway message, I think. So on this note, I would like to stop here, and I'll be very happy to take up all the questions and queries that you have related to the fiscal policy and the fiscal tools in our country. Okay. Yeah, so I think we can stop here, and if there are any questions, I would be happy to deal with those questions. I'll stop the screen sharing here.
Thank you, Aparna ma'am, for this wonderful session and for your views. I request students now to ask your questions. You can raise